Mariehamn in the Åland Islands of Finland and Port Victoria in South Australia are at the opposite ends of the world. The difference between the two towns is dramatic, and yet, despite these differences, they are linked by a bond that will join them together through the annals of seafaring history. These men and women, living at either end of the world, are members of the dwindling Cap Horniers Association. They are gathered to celebrate an era of the tall ships, otherwise known as the Windjammers or Cap Horniers. This is the story of those ships, the men who sailed them, and what must be the most exciting and dangerous sea race the world has ever seen.
I didn't appreciate the danger. I certainly do. When I look back on it, I shudder to think what we did.
No safety harness, and they were unheard of. This was our safety harness. Strong arms.
Not living from minute to minute, hour to hour, we're living from second to second.
The freight trains will thunder on, and the airplanes will roar. But the wind will not sigh again gently in the rigging of an old sailing ship. Beauty will be gone from the ocean, and an art form lost to the world. How soon? In 5 years, perhaps. Certainly in no more than 10. Last of the Wind Ships, Alan Villiers, 1934.
Sailing ships had carried the world's commerce for hundreds of years. The first ocean-going steamship was launched in 1818. But it was not until the 1890s that improvements in the design of steam engines made the steamship a more efficient cargo carrier over short to medium distance trade routes. Sailing ship owners were forced to find long-distance charters for their ships from places where a lack of facilities made it unprofitable for steamships to operate. Over time, as it became harder to compete, a steady stream of great sailing ships made their last trip to the breakers. As the death knell was ringing on the tall ships, Gustav Ericsson built up the last great sailing fleet the world would ever see. Ericsson's headquarters were not in London, Liverpool or Rotterdam, Boston or Bordeaux, but tiny Mariehamn, the capital of the Åland Islands of Finland.
He loved sailing ships. He used to compare a sailing ship with the full sails, swelling sails, with a pregnant woman. And he thought that was the two most beautiful things in the world. And there's so much emotions too when you see a pregnant woman, so you can just applicate these emotions he had also on the sailing ships. But also he was a very good businessman, and above all because he had the competency. He was a captain himself and had gone out to sea when he was only 12 years of age. So he really was one with the ships.
After World War I, the German government was forced to hand over most of their shipping to the conquering nations as part of war reparations. As none of these countries had use for the old sailing ships, Gustav Ericsson seized the opportunity to add to his fleet.
The four-masted bark Passat had been handed over to the French government, and she was in Marseille. And she was on offer for £11,000. So he sent Reuben de Clou down to Marseille to get her. On the way to Marseille, he got to Ostend. And in there were two other ships that had been taken over by the French government. One was the Herzog and Cecilia, and the other was the Mozart. Ericsson bought the Herzog and Cecilia, but he bought it unbeknown to him because Reuben de Clue bought her on the spot for £4,200.
The 1920s saw almost all shipping companies scrapping the last of their sailing ships as being uneconomic. Gamely reversing the trend, Ericsson kept adding to his fleet, picking up ships at scrap prices and managing them with great thrift. Ericsson was able to make them pay when others could not. In some cases, recovering the purchase price on the first voyage. The grain trade between Australia and Europe was one of the very few trades left to Ericsson's old windjammers. And the centre point of this trade was Port Victoria in South Australia's Spencer Gulf. As this last great fleet of sailing ships left Australian ports following the grain harvest, there was international interest generated in which ship would get to Europe in the shortest elapsed time. These annual events became known as the grain races and were widely followed in newspapers.
Yes, the grain races became important to him, I think partly because it was a local big interest for the sailing ships. Actually, the grain races became famous without his participation. But of course, once that it was a hit, he was thrilled to be competing.
Sailing ships have always raced. While two survive, they always will. Last of the Wind ships, Alan Villiers, 1934.
Alan Villiers was an Australian who shared Ericsson's passion for tall ships. A man of great vision, Villiers recognised that this was the last stand the tall ships would make before steamships would claim total domination of the high seas. Through his books, magazine articles and film, Villiers played the major role in bringing these last grain races to the attention of the world. In 1921, at the age of 18, he got his first job on a big sailing ship, the Bellens, sailing to Europe. He returned on Gustav Ericsson's Lawhill, sailing from France to Australia. Villiers was so inspired by his time in the Lawhill that he and his mate, Ron Walker, brought a movie camera and signed up as crew on another of Ericsson's ships, the Grace Harwa. An old ship, the Grace Harwa had no labour-saving devices, such as brace and halyard winches, and she had the reputation of killing at least one man on every voyage.
Used only God's wind, and the sea bashed them too, as you can see here, the sea bashed them. But they were built strong and they could take the bashing. Some were lost, of course, some were lost. That's the way life is, something's always going to be lost.
On lecture tours throughout America, Villiers inspired both paying passengers and young Americans like Tom Wells, who, like Villiers, took a camera and filmed his experiences on the Cape Horn Road.
I wanted to sail in the big Cape Horniers, the big square-rigged ships that sail around the world, down to Australia. I'd read about them through Alan Villiers' stories, and I just had the bug.
Irving Johnson was another American with a passion to film the rounding of Cape Horn on a big sailing ship. Johnson is best known for his self-narrated film, Around Cape Horn, which has a novel beginning.
I'm getting trained for Cape Horn, and this is the one way to do it. When you put on the brake, it's a disaster. But with a strong neck, I'm still alive and ready to climb up something that I could find on the farm nearest Cape Horn mast. This pole is rotten at the bottom, but it won't fall down on account of the wires. I'm swaying now, making believe I'm off the horn and getting ready for that sort of thing. But this is a kid with a one-track mind, if I ever saw one, just standing on his head to make sure he'd never be scared.
The 1920s saw sailing ship crews change from tough, hard, old-time career sailors who had seen the inside of every bar and brothel from Bristol to San Francisco, to young men fresh from school needing to get experience in sail, which was a requirement before entering officer training courses for the Merchant Marine.
We used to go down and look at the ships, and there was a lot of small sailing ships came into the port in my hometown. There was barks, barkentines, schooners, mostly wooden ships. We used to climb the rigging on all the ships that were laid up. And the first big sailing ship that we saw was the Pommern. And she was a big ship, the biggest ship ever to come into our little port. And I thought to myself, it would be great to sail on this ship one day.
Tor left school at 15 and found work on a schooner trading in the Baltic Sea, where the work was hard and the food bad.
We went into Mariehamn for shelter, and there was the Passat laid up with many other square riggers. And I went to Gustav Eriksson's office, and I got a job as deck boy in the Passat. Well, I went to sea because I wanted to become a master eventually, and I wanted to make a career of it.
Det här var för mig ganska nytt att komma ombord på ett segelfartyg, för jag kom så sent in dagen innan fartyget skulle gå, och jag hade inte någon erfarenhet att vara med och slå segel och gå i riggen och så vidare. Of the Röjen, and he stayed there, and he took ett tag om masten där och höll i, och jag visste ju inte hur man skulle lägga fast seglet.
On the outward voyage to Australia, the ship sailed down the Baltic Sea from Åland past Copenhagen and into the North Sea. A square-rigged sailing ship is awkward to maneuver and is a poor performer sailing to windward. With a gale of wind from ahead, she is barely able to hold her ground. The confined waters of the English Channel were usually avoided, but sailing north around Scotland also had its problems.
The North Sea in the wintertime is a horrible place. We stayed there week after week until this greatest storm of the century came up. This storm wrecked 68 ships along the coasts of Belgium, Holland, and Germany.
While working with Tor Lindquist on the Passat, Tom Wells took movie footage of the dying hours of a hurricane that hit them off the coast of Scotland.
The heavy winds of the North Atlantic began to increase. This is the same time the hurricane hit off New England and stretched out over into the North Atlantic. We are all furled down to just lower topsails and just 12 sails or so. They're battening down the hatches.
We're out in the North Atlantic, and that's when the hurricane hit us. All of a sudden, like a shot, blew out half a dozen sails or more. And the ship heeled over about 60 degrees. The ship was in ballast, and she heeled over until the water came up to the hatch coamings on the lee side. The sea looked like smoke. You couldn't see the horizon. You couldn't see anything. The sky and the horizon was in one like a whiteout. It was so bad that if you opened your mouth to windward, you couldn't close it. The captain stood on deck for over 24 hours. He was lashed to the weather rigging. Otherwise, he couldn't have stood on his feet. He was a very worried man. If the ballast had shifted, we would have been goners. Tom Wells He couldn't do anything with his camera while the bad weather lasted because he was too busy working. But after, when the weather eased a bit, he got his camera out after the hurricane, and he got a few good shots.
Once clear of the British Isles, the ships often picked up strong westerly winds in the North Atlantic, which gave them a grand start on their long voyage. The big Cape Horners were the peak in the evolution of the sailing ship. They were the pinnacle of efficiency, carrying bulk cargoes over long distances under sail. While not as fast as the smaller tea-clippers of earlier times, they could make good speed in favourable conditions.
But here we have 4 propellers chewing along, chewing up the wake, going like a bat. 4 propellers? No, it's simply the wind in the sails that we made with our own hands, that we put up there with our own hands, and we adjusted with our own hands. Roaring along she is now, 12, 14, 15, 16 knots. Tremendous, 8,000 tons, bowling along, going where we want to go, not necessarily where she wants to go.
The reliable trade winds had been known for centuries to blow in certain latitudes, and the sailing ship had to make the best use of these to take her lonely voyage around the world. As she sails south and loses the westerlies, she picks up the northeast trade winds, which give way to the belt of light variables which straddle the equator. This area is known as the doldrums, and can delay a ship for weeks if she's unlucky. South of the doldrums, she finds the southeast trades, and once she reaches 40 degrees south latitude, she picks up the westerlies, which drive her eastward to Australia and Port Victoria.
We are now squared away below Cape Good Hope, and we're running her easting down to Australia. We're about 500 miles below Cape Town, and she's going about 17 knots, and she rolls and runs as days pass on.
One of the last great gatherings of sailing ships in the world took place at Port Victoria in December 1933. While some ships dispersed around the Gulf to load at various ports, others remained to discharge ballast and load grain. This was also one of the last times that 8 square-rigger captains could be found in one place to pose for this unique photo taken by Ian Edwards. His sister Alison recalls the impact the ship's crews had on the small town.
When the boys came in off the ships, they'd come to the balls and they'd be all standing in the doorway, and when the music would start, they'd march up the centre of the hall and turn and bow. Well, you never knew for sure which one they were bowing at, but someone would get up, and dance with them. Used to have marvellous suppers here. They were renowned everywhere, and of course these boys would just love them, and they'd go back over onto the board again and look forward to the next ball, and they'd be in again.
My first impression of it was the end of the world, because we sailed for 14,000 miles, coming from Finland to Hamburg and all the big ports in London. Well, that was the end of the world, Port Victoria.
The Pommern was the main ship really for us because, we got to know the officers well, and they were all, very nice people. And they'd come up home quite a bit and have music. They had a ball out there one night. We'd be dancing around the deck and having the time of our lives. Then we'd all have to pile into the motorboats and come back again. Captain Carl Granith was the captain of the Pommern at that stage, and Carl Broman was the chief mate, and he was a very nice chappie.
Och det var en massa flickor bland annat och Ja, vi då killar tyckte att det var intressant det här. Ja, där träffar man någon som dansade Lambert Walk där borta på kvällen. Och sen då på söndagarna och lördagarna så promenerade, så kom de och hälsade på flickorna och så tog de en i handen då och gick där och pratade. Och, ja, så där är mamma och där är pappa där, så de. Men vi kan promenera här. Ja, här är kusten är klar. Det var mycket intressant tid.
I think everybody enjoyed the time that they came here because, you know, it created a lot of interest and of course created a lot of work.
It was a very, very, very busy place in the 1930s with all the grain vessels coming in and the amount of grain that was delivered to Port Victoria directly from the farmers, and then the grain that was brought here from the outlying ports. The catchers or lighters, as we referred to them as, they used to call in and pick up the grain from those ports and then bring it up to Port Victoria, and it would be offloaded directly onto the sailing vessels.
They had discovered that there was little of romance in these ships, and very much work and horrible discomfort. They looked on Australia as a land of chance. By way of Cape Horn, Alan Villiers, 1929.
Once the ships were loaded, they were ready to sail. But the same couldn't be said for the crew. Some had experienced enough hard work and discomfort and jumped ship to see more of Australia. Young Australian men who had heard about the grain races were eager to replace the deserters.
I wanted to be Cape Horner. Came round to the Port Victoria Hotel here, and I was amazed. Some of the crew were ashore, and sheath knives put in their belts, berets on their hats, and sea boots on, and they're having a wonderful time in the Port Vic Hotel. The chief mate was there. He could lift a table up in the Port Vic Hotel with his teeth and stand at right angles, put himself at right angles to a pole in the bar, at right angles with his muscles. Have you ever tried that? For God's sake.
I was surprised. I just come off a passenger ship where everything was supplied. We had bed and everything, and there was nothing there for me, just a bare bunk. Well, the steward found me a mattress. I got an empty flour bag from the cook. I filled it up with chaff from the sheep feed for a pillow. The sailmaker gave me a single strip of canvas for a sheet, old canvas, and then I had a couple of blankets from somebody who had deserted the ship. And that was all my bedding for the trip round Cape Horn.
I had no idea really what I was letting myself in for. Had I been able to, I think, jump overboard and swim ashore or jump on a boat, I no doubt would have done it, because I thought, well, if I've got to get up this mast, this high and this awkward, down south in the rough conditions that are going to be obviously be down there, I don't need that. But there was no way, of course, of being able to swim ashore. I was on that ship, and that's where I was going to stay for 4 months.
The life nets were strung up, and I remember thinking at the time, gee whiz, that's high. You have a life net up as high as that, and you couldn't jump up to get it. But I realised, or soon came to learn why, these experienced Swedes and Finns, they knew all about Cape Horn.
Of course, heights was a thing, 195 feet up, over the rat lines, up the cross trees, and up again, more cross trees, up the royals. I said to myself at that stage, an order's an order, I've got to do it somehow.
It was not only men who were interested in experiencing the closing era of the tall ships. Alan Villiers' writings inspired passengers like young South Australian woman Jocelyn Hall, who sailed on the last voyage of the Viking in 1947.
I read all Alan Villiers' books I could get hold of from the local public library. After the war, I was going to go to England to do postgraduate studies. And then a friend said, oh, the sailing ships are advertising for passengers. So then I rushed off and got a passage on the Viking.
Another passenger was Oxford-educated journalist and adventurer Pamela Bourne.
She spent quite a long time in the South Seas and riding a horse through New Zealand, and then she was looking for more adventure, and she signed on the Hetchigan as apprentice passenger in Wallaroo. What happened was the usual old story. She fell in love with the captain and he with her. I think there was quite a lot of thought behind it, because she was also very fond of the first mate, but it was the captain who won.
If there is a race, I'm not in it, said the Palmer's commander. If there is a race, count me out of it, said the master of the Melbourne. I have never raced in my life, said Declue. Well, well, well. No one going to race, but all desperately anxious to be first. Last of the windships, Alan Villiers.
Daphne Villiers, the wife of Alan Villiers, kept a diary when she accompanied her husband on the Palmer in the 1932 grain race. Villiers was a part owner of the ship, which was under the command of Captain Reuben Declue.
Thursday, March 17. To sea. We sailed at evening in bright moonlight with a starry sky. No flags, no ballyhoo and no onlookers. We were anchored 8 miles out. We left at 8 p.m, I being at the wheel with Alan. It was a great moment when the boys set the sails, a sight I shall never forget.
If the young Australians who joined the ship in South Australia had any romantic visions of life at sea, they were soon dashed out of them. Observing strict economy, Ericsson's ships set out to traverse the wildest ocean in the world with the smallest crews in history.
All those vessels were undermanned. They were really designed for about 80-man crew, all told. We had, all told, captain and everyone, 34. So they were grossly undermanned. And at the end of their life, they were trying to maintain them in a seaworthy condition, but skimping as much as they possibly could to try and make them pay. The navigation lights, they wouldn't put kerosene in them when they were down in the real southern latitudes. Why worry? There's no one here, and you were charging through the water there with no navigation lights at all, just to save kerosene. That's a pretty good example.
We've had company again today. Beating through Bass Strait at the northeast of Tasmania, we thought at first it was Alma Dopel, but she had too much square sail. She was a big ship, a Cape Horn grain racer, like ourselves, C.B. Pedersen. We were surprised to see her, as the captain had figured out this way as a shortcut. The captain watched her all day like a cat does a mouse, seeking to outdo her for the lead.
A lot of skippers went round the Cape of Good Hope because they had old ships and the ships were rotten and they didn't want to risk Cape Horn. But most of them went around Cape Horn because you had fair winds all the way, or almost all the way, and you could make a quicker passage around Cape Horn. Quicker, but not safer. The skipper knew better than anyone else of all the dangers.
We had chosen the Cape Horn road because they blow hard down there, those wild west winds, and they hurry the windship on along her stormy way. By way of Cape Horn, Alan Villiers, 1929.
Down in the westerlies, the wind usually started up from the north and go to northwest with rain and blow like hell. And then you had to watch out for the swing to the southwest, and that could happen very suddenly. And if you didn't know it was coming, you'd be caught aback. You'd be caught by the lee, and the ship would be in irons. So the officer on watch had to keep his eyes open. And as soon as you see a split in the clouds and a bit of blue sky, then you had to pay her off before the wind would swing around to southwest. And then it would blow real hard and squally, with squalls up to force 12.
And when I say big seas, nobody can really comprehend how big they are unless honestly they have been down and experienced. These boys that go down to the polar business and that, they would have a pretty good idea what it's like. The waves can be anything up to 3/4 of a mile in between the crests and the crests, and the big swells and with they have 3 huge waves on top of them.
As uncomfortable as the voyage may be, a modern Antarctic supply vessel traverses the Southern Ocean in just a few days. A sailing ship, deep loaded, with her main deck only 2 meters above the waterline, spent weeks making her way along the Cape Horn Road, taking seas aboard almost constantly.
We had a southwesterly gale for days and days. Sometimes it would blow the hurricane force. And the sea got bigger and bigger. And when the ship is running down into the trough of the sea, the upper topsail would be without wind, hang slack. And that's over 100 feet up. So you can imagine the size of the waves. I've heard of helmsmen leaving the wheel and running away when a big sea came up. And that could be the end of the ship. She could broach to, or she could lose her sticks.
One of the highest speeds recorded for a big, deep-laden sailing ship was by the Herzegovina Cecilia, sailing the Cape Horn Road in the 1936 grain race. Captain Sven Eriksson was in command.
Running from Port Lincoln, south of New Zealand, a hell of a gale. Ellis Carlson was the officer of the watch. He said, and all at once the gale rose and it shrieked. He said, I put my whistle between my lips to blow to start to shorten down. He said, and then I stopped. He said, she was going direct on her course. He said, I looked at the helmsman and there was 2 men to the wheel. He said, they hardly moved. The ship was steering herself. He said, this beautiful ship was sailing herself. And he said, it went on for 4 hours like that. Then he said, went into the chart room and looked at the clock. He said, she was doing 18 knots loaded. He said, then the wind stopped and she settled down and she started to roll again. She didn't roll when she was doing that. She just charged.
The wild Southern Ocean is the realm of the great wandering albatross. These huge birds held special significance for Cape Horn sailors.
We're all friends of albatrosses. Sometimes they flew into our sails and landed on the deck. We looked after them and put them away. The superstition was, of course, for every albatross is a sailor who had been drowned around Cape Horn.
Friday, April 15th. Plenty of snow today. I went on deck this afternoon just as the snowstorm began. It was a very lovely sight. The ship rolling along under all sail and the snow falling. But it was not so pleasant for the 2 boys who were working on the upper topgallant yard.
Down there, ice and snow, you're aloft, and I recall one time when I came down, and others the same, with the back of our oilskins torn to shreds from the hailstones, the big hailstones hitting us.
When you've been at sea for a while, you had a second sense. If there's a big belly in the sail, just that second you knew the wind was out of it. Just a couple of spreads and you had to get it in quickly. Otherwise the wind would catch again, it'd almost send you back over the yard. It'd fill up like a big balloon and send you back over the yard. That nearly happened to me once.
And sometimes you have to get out of the way and sit down on the foot rope and wait for the squall to blow over and then start again. We were furling the Crojack. We were about 8 men on the port yard arm. And we got the sail furled, and I was hauling away on the gasket, and there was a bit of slack on the gasket underneath the sail, which I didn't know, and it gave way and I fell backwards. And how I got hold of the foot rope and the stirrup, I don't know, but I hung on to the foot rope and I swung my legs up over the foot rope, and my 2 shipmates on either side hold me back up. So they helped to save my life. And if I had fallen, I would have landed on deck, and that would have been the end of me. So I was very, very lucky. And when I got back up on the foot rope, we just carried on regardless. But when I got down on deck, I felt a bit nervous.
You're trying to furl the sail and it would blow back and out would come fingernails. And it was a pretty tough life down there, that's for sure.
We used to get what you call sea cracks on the sides of your fingers. You get deep cracks, and the salt water gets in there and it hurts like hell. And the best remedy was urine on your hands and on your neck, where you had oilskin chafe on your neck.
One of the seamen there, he got his hand pulled through a cast block, you know, on the deck. They were letting out a sheet, and he got his fingers going through this steel block and mangled all his fingers up, and they raised him up. They got the captain down, the steward down, the carpenter, and they gave him about half a bottle of rum, and he was fat like a pig, you know, and they put him on the kitchen table, and they put a rope around his arm, and the carpenter had a sharp axe, you know, he chopped his fingers off, and they trimmed them up, and the steward had a bottle of iodine. He dabbed them all with iodine at the end, you know, and that wasn't terribly good. Still, he had to go up and take in sails one hand.
And sometimes we'd be there for 2 hours to furl the foresail, and then we would come down and hopefully get a drink from the skipper. And then the wind would ease, and we'd set the foresail again, and that was a sailor's life.
The shortest and quickest route to Cape Horn was to sail well south into the howling 50s, where icebergs were a very real danger. It will never be known how many ships posted as missing sank after collision with an iceberg. With less than 20 ships still sailing the far Southern Ocean in the late 1920s and 30s, 2 disappeared without trace. In 1928, the mighty 5-masted Danish cadet ship Copenhagen disappeared with all hands on an outward voyage to Australia. In 1938, the Admiral Karpfanger, a German cadet ship, disappeared between Australia and Cape Horn.
This is what would happen. They'd get pushed further south trying to get wind, the right winds, and of course then you've got the threat of icebergs.
Crushed together, the watch, duty watch, under the forecastle head with lanterns between our legs, paper down our rubber boots to try and keep warm. We had no warmth whatsoever. The galley stove was out. No one could keep it alive.
That they were so cold that they peed in a bottle, then took the bottle to bed to try and warm their feet. So that's the kind of, the desperate acts you get to.
Wednesday, April 16th. The captain says it is the worst storm he has been in for 10 years. Beyond a bruise or 2 on my arms, I made out okay. The captain has hurt his leg, but he's able to hobble around. The poor apprentices have lost practically everything, home goods and all. It is pathetic to see them today, each one drying what few things he has left.
We saw ice we've never seen before. We saw snow that half of us never saw before in our lives. You can't actually bring the sails in, they're so frozen stiff. Your nails are bleeding at the wick, your cheeks are bleeding with the hail, and you're really frozen up there, the wind howling through your oilskins.
The sea would come over higher than this safety net they'd put there, and if you were slow on your feet or slow thinking, well, you were very likely to get washed overboard. There was many a time on this journey where people, you know, the sea, they couldn't hang on. The sea would come aboard so hard, smash aboard the vessel, they'd get swept around, you know, and you'd think, gee, is he going to survive this? Could be washed up against the side of the ship or washed up against a bollard or something like that.
But we had lifelines rigged, but even then people have almost gone over the side. They've been grabbed as they've been just going over the side.
Very difficult steering. You had to move the wheel all the time, non-stop. You'd sweat, even in cold weather. We had a rope with a canvas loop over our shoulder, and the rope made fast to a ring bolt in the deck, so you couldn't be thrown over the wheel. Because men have been thrown over the wheel and broken their bones and perhaps been thrown over the side.
Sailing ships were operated on a 2-watch or 2-shift system, meaning that crew were on deck at least 12 hours a day. In Ericsson's undermanned ships, some tasks were too much for one watch to handle. The call, all hands on deck, was all too common.
You'd be so tired and so cold and so long without sleep that it didn't matter that your bunk was saturated. You'd curl up and hoping to get some sleep, and you could hear the whistles. The one whistle, it's still in my mind today. I can hear it as I'm talking now. The one whistle, porpoise, 2 whistle, not my watch, 3 whistle, the dreaded 3 whistle, all hands on deck. And as I say, it's with me today. I hear it still.
Half the time there was water swimming around in the forecastle, you know. We just sort of took it for granted, you know. Actually, I think we were a bit glad to get in out the weather, you know.
Well, sometimes we'd be on deck for over 24 hours, non-stop working. We would get a few minutes off to go and eat. There's something to eat. No hot food, no hot drinks.
With men working under such extreme conditions, accidents were inevitable.
Because there were casualties. Casualties of ships, whole ships, gone missing, overwhelmed in the sea, smashed up on the rocks there down near those unlit coasts as they were then of Tierra del Fuego. All right. Man doesn't live forever. If he lives a challenging and adventurous life while he may, that's not such a bad idea.
On the voyage that Villiers and Walker took on the Grace Hawa, the ship was to keep up her deadly average of killing at least 1 man every voyage. On the 38th day out, Ronald Walker was killed by a falling yardarm. The last entry in his diary was that he could not understand how, if men had gone this way before and suffered so much, they could ever go again. Walker's body was consigned to the deep with a short ceremony conducted by the captain.
The trepidation was, we'd been reading Sea Breezes, and that showed all the vessels from time to time, from one book to another, how many men and how many ships had been lost there without trace. It was frightening. They kept, I said, stop reading those jolly books. We're around Cape Horn, we've got to act as a team. We can't be depressed, we've got to keep our spirits up. And strength. Strength was a thing we had to keep up.
The ships would continue through the howling 50s to make their way around the treacherous Cape Horn, which lies at 56 degrees south latitude. Westerly winds blow violently in these far southern latitudes, and seas, unimpeded by any continent as they circle the globe, build up to tremendous heights. The only barrier to these great forces is Drake's Passage, between Cape Horn and the Antarctic Peninsula. The passage became nature's battleground as wind and sea fight their way through this constriction of the elements. Hundreds of ships and thousands of lives have been lost off Cape Horn.
We are off Cape Horn now. This is on another Sunday, and I went up aloft, and these are the first colored pictures ever taken on this planet Earth, going around Cape Horn in a great big cargo vessel under sail. It was a lovely day. It was Easter Sunday, and it wasn't too bad at all.
The 1939 grain race was immortalized by Eric Newby in his book, The Last Grain Race. Newby was in the Mashulu. Tor Lindquist and Tom Wells were in the Passat. Fortunately, this rounding of the Horn took place in only a moderate gale.
We saw another square rig, and that was the Mashulu. And right off Cape Horn, and we could see Cape Horn in the distance. And this ship, and she had all her sails set, and we had our royals furled. So we quickly set our royals to try and keep up with the Mashulu. And the best speed we did was 17 knots, and everything was going just fine. And the ship was shuddering and shivering from the strain and stress of the sails. And then the skipper lost his nerve, and he started to take in sails, take in the royals and up with the gallants, and he got frightened. He didn't want to lose any more canvas.
In rare periods of fine weather, rounding Cape Horn could be uneventful. But far more often for sailing ships, it became the world's deadliest passage of water.
Tortured, 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 just like the water coming over Niagara Falls. Look at this, the open ocean. The forces involved are fantastic. There's no words that I can use in any language that'll tell you what it's like.
Irving Johnson did his filming aboard the German bark Peking in 1929, making a westerly rounding of Cape Horn in the dying days of the Chilean nitrate trade. Westerly roundings, sailing into the teeth of storms, were generally much more difficult than easterly roundings made with the wind behind. But for Ericsson's undermanned ships with boy crews, easterly roundings were bad enough, especially in winter.
We brought up religious, a lot of us, but some weren't religious at all. But I can tell you, they became very, very religious after a time. We thought we'd never see land again. We never dreamed we'd ever have a hope of seeing land again. We're not living from minute to minute, hour to hour. We're living from second to second.
It was about abreast of Cape Horn. The ship was in real danger. The captain was so concerned that he called us all on deck, and we stood under the forecastle head. The ship had heeled over to such a degree, and the weather was so bad that you couldn't get aloft to cut that sail free, not without high risk. Although the first mate, who was a Superman type of man, he was the toughest man you could ever dream could exist. He was prepared to have a go, but the captain wouldn't let him, because it was near certain that he wouldn't have got there. But anyway, God was looking kindly on us that day, and most of the young crew, they didn't really realise the danger they were in, and I don't think I did either. But when I look back and think about, that's why we're under the forecastle head, and the skipper didn't think that that boat was going to come out of that.
Rounding Cape Horn loomed large in the minds of the crew of any sailing ship. It was with great relief that they left this treacherous stretch of ocean astern and set their course northward into the warmer waters of the Atlantic.
Hour to hour and day to day, it was getting warmer all the time. And we could feel it. And the southeast trades kept us steady. What a wonderful experience to have a steady ship. We get tropical downpours. With the ship steady, we could block the scuppers up, and the water would fill up there and almost have a swimming pool. At last, we can wash our clothes. from the Cape Horn, still covered with salt.
We were given a jug of hot water every morning, and we were supposed to make the best of that. You learn to wash yourself with very little water when you haven't got more. But then when we had tropical downpours, then everybody went on deck and scrubbed themselves. That was delightful, to feel the beautiful, lukewarm, tropical rain on you. I washed my hair in it too.
For Gustav Eriksson, the size of the crew needed to safely sail the ship was of lesser importance than economic viability. He was known for cutting all running expenses to the bone, including the cost of feeding the crew.
Food was bad. No doubt about that. Nobody liked the food.
Maggots in the porridge and Weevily biscuits and things like that, you know.
And when I joined the Mashuru, she'd been laid up in the States for 7 years, and there'd been casks of salted meat stored away in the forepeak. And when we were to see, this old meat was brought out again and served up for us to eat. And it smelled terrible and it tasted terrible.
We killed our biggest pig today, and to my horrible amazement, at tea, reclining in a place of honour on the table, was its liver. I'm afraid I made a great faux pas by declining it, with thanks. The he-men soon made short work of it.
Well, I didn't find the food bad. A lot of people did complain. They took a couple of pigs to give them a bit of fresh meat, and they were eventually slaughtered. And that would be a story in itself, how they'd usually muck that up. Eventually they'd shoot the pig.
They ran a mail and spike into his jugular vein, pig's jugular vein, and drained all the blood out, and then they made blood pancakes out of that. And the Finns thought that was a delicacy, you know.
And actually I didn't mind them, but there were other Australians aboard and they just couldn't face up to a blood pancake.
Revolted at it when I first saw it, you know.
It was a long passage from the Horn to the line, and the fact that at that time of the year, late summer and early autumn, a long passage was to be expected didn't make it any easier for us to bear. Falmouth for orders. Alan Villiers, 1928.
Tuesday, May 17th. We still have the trades, also some heavy tropical rain. The boys are now changing sail and putting up tropical rags. The hens have begun laying again today, and the bare backs of the boys look like the rising sun.
You would have the heavy weather sails, and you would have the medium weather sails, and you have the light weather sails, and so on. So you were constantly changing sails. That was the general pattern with sailing ships, but more so in towards the end of their trading days.
Yes, in the trade winds, when we had beautiful weather, when I watched below, before we turned in, we used to go up forward and yarn and sing. And we used to sing all sorts of sailor songs. And some songs we used to make up our own words, but I can't repeat them. Tom Wells was a nice fellow, full of jokes, and he was a good artist in those days already. And he used to do beautiful paintings of nude women, etc. And the seamen loved that.
Another time we caught a shark, and that was put up on deck, and they hit it with caps and bars, bashed it till they killed it, and the fin was nailed onto the bowsprit, the tip of the bowsprit, for good luck. That was an old superstition of the sea.
But you get up into the southeast trade winds and so forth, and that's why people go back on those ships. They remember the good times, and that was it.
Sunday, May 22nd. Much better wind today, and we do 9 knots. If this keeps up, we will cross the line tomorrow.
Neptune's court rises out of the sea. On board they come. All the old shellbacks who had sailed around Cape Horn the year before. They are here to initiate the pollywogs who were out on the first passage.
Crossing the line was interesting, of course. Those who hadn't been across, they'd made a mess of those. A canvas sheet full of salt water and tar, and have a piece of cheese. It was the same colour as cheese. You'd swear it was cheese. It was a piece of soap. Oh hell, murder.
And looked through the binoculars for the equator, which is the line, and of course that consisted of 2 bottles, and a tape was across that. And without realising it, of course, and we thought, oh, well, we'll look through that, and there's the line sort of thing. But, of course, the bottles were full of water. And as they put it up, you copped an eye full of salt water.
I had crossed the line as a baby because I was born in England, so I escaped. But our stewardess had to be initiated, and they daubed a bit of tar on her, but they didn't tar her as much as they did the Australians who were being initiated. They got thoroughly tarred.
It is a regrettable fact that this stage is often the worst. Here in the North Atlantic in May and June, we're most subject to delay. Falmouth for orders. Alan Villiers, 1928.
By the time they reached the North Atlantic, the sailors could have been away for 9 or 10 months. These long separations had a profound effect on the wives and families back home.
Well, up until the Second World War, the husband can be away for years, but more commonly it would be maybe 11 months or 12 months and then back for 1 month.
The women actually looked after the farms. They looked after everything at home. So the women were very powerful people and ruled the roost. And the men came home and provided the babies and the money. Off they went again.
For 1 and 2 years. And we didn't see anybody. My daughter, I saw her the first time, 2 years and 3 days old.
The main reason to worry for these women are whether their husbands are going to come home alive or not. Because I just assumed that infidelity would be the first worry for these women, but that came quite far down actually on the list.
Saturday, June 11th. At daylight, we see another sailing ship. 11 of our boys, including third mate, put out our starboard lifeboat and pull across to sea. I asked to go too. Captain thought it was quite safe for me to go. It took 5 hours to row across, and then we found out it was Pamir, as many days out as us.
Once the wind did pick up, the ships could face not only strong winds, but storms and hurricanes.
The Pamir, when we got across the equator, we're approaching the Cape Verde Islands, which are just north of the equator. Midnight, starry sky. Just a very slight zephyr of wind. All the sails were up. By 6 o'clock that morning, it was blowing 125 knots. 4 of us were caught up on the yard and couldn't get back up. And the 4 of us was included me. And when I was being strapped over the yard, what I mean by strapped is pressed over with that velocity of wind, all you could do was just hang on, because the ship was so far over on its side that you couldn't get back up the foot ropes. And all I can remember about being on that yard, or the main thing I can remember, besides running out of breath because the wind was going past, so creating a low pressure behind your head. You couldn't sort of go like that, otherwise it would blow your eyes out. So we just hung on like that, and all of a sudden I heard a yell right alongside me, and I thought, God, Murray's gone, you know, blown off or something. And I looked and he was still there, but his back was bare. The wind had picked up the shirt off his back and singlet that he had on. Wind had got underneath it, picked up and ripped it straight off his shoulders and everything else. And there he was alongside me, barebacked, nothing on except a pair of shorts. And I've never forgotten, and all I can remember seeing was his shirt and the thing going off in the distance, in the murk of the hurricane there.
Saturday, June 18th. This day last week, we were on Pamir. Today, we have cleared the Azores and are on the last stretch to Falmouth.
The ships made landfall at either Falmouth in England or Queenstown in Ireland, where the race finished. There, they received their orders as to where their cargo was to be unloaded. At the end of the 1936 grain race, Ericsson's beautiful flagship, Herzegovina Cecilia, ran aground on the coast of Devon and became a total loss.
We were anxious to hear of the other ships. And the first news we got when we reached our anchorage off Queenstown was they'd lost the Herzegovina Cecilia. And that was sad because I don't think it was necessary.
A 2-month effort was made to refloat her without success. People came from far and wide to see the wreck stranded below the cliffs.
My father was captain on the Herzegovina Cecilia, and it irritates me sometimes that people only mention him putting her aground on the south coast of England. He was, after all, captain on Herzegovina Cecilia for 8 years without many mishaps.
Thursday, June 30th. Pamir made Queenstown yesterday afternoon. Therefore, we consider we have won, as we sailed together from Port Broughton, and Falmouth is 70 miles further to sail.
Throughout the 1930s, the arrival of the grain ships was widely reported in newspapers both in the United Kingdom and abroad.
We were a total of 112 days to anchor off Queenstown.
We took 130 days.
Well, surely won the grain race. We had 91 days. Australia to England, we had 98 days.
We were 144 days from Port Victoria to Falmouth, which was a long trip.
Between 1921 and 1949, 21 grain races were recorded. There were no races during the Second World War. The last race was contested in 1949 between the Passat and the Pamir, with the Passat being the winner in a time of 110 days. The grain race of 1928 stands out with special significance. It was made famous by Alan Villiers in his book Falmouth for Orders. The battle for shortest passage was fought out between the Swedish Beatrice and Ericsson's Herzegovina Cecilia.
This grain race trophy was actually awarded to my grandfather because the Herzegovina Cecilia, his really flagship, was the fastest one in the grain races in 1928, and I think it has become famous, and it's very beautiful with the Sea Lady and the globe and the star with the diamond at the top.
World War II struck a severe blow to Ericsson's business. He lost 8 ships from his fleet through action by enemy submarines and mines, and others were seized in foreign ports. The Kiloran was sunk by a German raider, and the Olive Bank met a similar fate in late 1939.
It was about the 10th of September that the Olive Bank was going across the North Sea, and halfway across she struck a mine and sank. It took half the crew with her, including the captain, Captain Carl Granith. A very sad business. Those that were rescued were, for 2 days, hanging onto one of the the spars that were sticking up, the mast was still sticking up. The other masts had gone overboard with the explosion.
Gustav Eriksson tried to revive the trade after World War II with the few ships he had left, but conditions had changed. The Viking and the Passat were sent to sea in 1946. A year later, Gustav Eriksson passed away. In 1949, the Pamir, which had been seized by New Zealand in wartime, was returned to his company. In May of that year, the Passat and the Pamir sailed from Australia with grain for the last time. When the Herzegovina Cecilia was wrecked on the English coast in 1936, Gustav Eriksson had the poop section containing the captain's cabins and saloon area salvaged and brought to Mariehamn, where it is a lasting reminder of the splendor of that once great sailing ship.
He was on Panape there?
Yeah, Panape.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Was that when you were there?
I was there also.
Yeah.
I was next boy, 34, on board in Panape.
Oh yeah. How many Matssons were there? Because I can't really...
I don't know.
We had a Matsson for a while on Passat, but...
Like the grain races, the men and women who took part in this extraordinary race are gradually conceding to time. Yet even after the last Cape Horner has crossed the bar, their stories will live on. An inspiration for all who are willing to face extraordinary challenges.
I liked the sailing ships because we sailed around the world without polluting the sea, without polluting the air, without noise pollution, and the wind was free.
When I look back on it, I shudder to think what we did. But that was the way of it.
Actually, the effect on me, like as an experience or what to do, was I found nothing impossible to do.
I'm glad I didn't jump overboard at the beginning and try to swim ashore. It certainly gave me a different perspective on life and what it was all about.
A wonderful experience. It was all part of life. I did something that not many people have done or could do today.
Well, it was an experience out of this world.
They talk of romance of square riggers. As you're getting older, you can see where the romance is, but at the time, it wasn't very romantic.